In 1875, William James, who had received his medical degree, began teaching a course in psychology at Harvard, and that same year would go on to set up what some consider to be the first psychological lab in America. In 1883, G. Stanley Hall opened the first American experimental psychological research laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. Hall would later go on to be the president of Clark University, and several of Hall's students would go on to open other research labs in the United States. In 1887, the third psychological research lab was opened by James Cattell at the University of Pennsylvania. Cattell would later go on to become president of the APA and would most remembered for trying to establish psychology as a hard science, much like chemistry.
William Lowe Bryan founded the fourth psychology lab at Indiana University Bloomington in January 1888. The lab was originally part of the philosophy department and was the first psychology lab in the Midwest. In 1902, Bryan left his lab to serve as president of the university. Early research in the lab focused on educational issues and pedagogy, but later its strengths included the areas of animal conditioning, clinical psychology, and psychophysiology, each of which had its own specialized laboratory facilities. Psychology finally became its own department separate from philosophy at the end of the 1920s. In the 1940s, renowned behaviorist B.F. Skinner served as a faculty member in the psychology department at IU. In 1888, Joseph Jastrow founded the country's fifth experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was hired as professor of experimental and comparative psychology. Jastrow's main research interests were psychophysics and optical illusions, and his earlier work helped introduce blind experiments and randomization to psychological studies. Early research at Wisconsin included hypnosis, psycholinguistics, and psychophysics. Notable alumni include Clark L. Hull, who received a Ph.D. in 1918 and taught at Wisconsin until 1929, and Abraham Maslow, who received a Ph.D. in psychology from Wisconsin in 1934. Edmund Sanford founded the sixth experimental psychology laboratory at Clark University in 1889. Sanford previously worked with G. Stanley Hall, who became Clark University's first president. Within psychology, Clark is perhaps most famous for being the location of the only lectures Sigmund Freud gave in the United States, which took place in 1909. Freud was invited to the university by Hall, and the lecture series is credited for introducing psychoanalysis to the U.S.
In 1889, the seventh experimental psychology laboratory was established by William Noyes at the McLean Asylum in Waverly, Massachusetts. One of his early studies investigated the psychological conditions of subjects with terminal dementia. He found that sensory stimuli received during sleep produced a greater effect over a longer period of time in patients with dementia than healthy individuals. Research at the McLean Asylum was all-encompassing, including work from chemistry, microbiology, pathology, and psychology. Never before was research conducted in a psychiatric institute in America. With the establishment of laboratories at the McLean Asylum, resources were now available for the study of psychiatric disorders. Harry Kirk Wolff founded the first experimental laboratory at the University of Nebraska in 1889. This became the eighth experimental psychology laboratory in the United States. This lab was a part of an undergraduate experimental psychology class and was established for teaching purposes. Research began the fall of 1989 with the study of color vocabulary of children. The study of time perception, Weber's law, and the speed of mental operation were also among the experiments that Wolff's undergraduate students conducted. Additionally, Wolff was a part of the child study movement, conducting studies on children's sensory capacity, sense of humor, play attention span, etc. He taught 3 students who would later become the president of the American Psychological Association. Wolff's experimental lab was important to the establishment of undergraduate research labs in the country. While most institutions believe the psychological method should be left for graduate studies, He did not believe introductory psychology should be taught to undergraduates without a lab component. He advocated for more institutions to open undergraduate labs to teach undergraduates the methods of the new psychology. In 1890, the Ninth Experimental Psychology Lab was founded by James Hayden Tufts at the University of Michigan. With Tufts being a part of the functionalism movement in America, 3 hours a week were devoted to basic studies on reaction time, color sense, Weber's law, and physiological exercises. Unfortunately, Tufts left the University of Michigan in 1891. However, the laboratory that he created marked the beginning of experimental work at the University of Michigan.
G. T. W. Patrick, who studied under G. Stanley Hall at Johns Hopkins University, would go on to start a laboratory in 1890 at the University of Iowa. Patrick would use the university laboratory to study speech impediments and speech therapy. In 1891, Mary Winton Calkins founded the 13th Experimental Psychology Lab at Wellesley College. This was the first psychology lab established by a woman. Calkins would later go on to become the first woman president of the APA. In 1892, Celestia Susanna Parrish founded a psychology lab at Randolph-Macon University in Ashland, Virginia. She studied under E. B. Titchener.